you so much to Books Are Magic, as always, for being the host of this series. And also thank you to LitHub for being a sponsor and publishing the edited transcripts of these events. When I started Red Ink several years ago, I wanted to put together a salon-like panel that focused on women writers and women writers writing in all genres. So this is something that I've been doing as a quarterly series for several years now, and I really love doing it. The title Red Ink came from my friend Lauren Sarand, who's a wonderful writer and book publicist. She knew that Virginia Woolf is my favorite writer, and there is a great quote from Mrs. Dalloway. He thought her beautiful, believed her impeccably wise, dreamed of her, wrote poems to her, which, ignoring the subject, she corrected in red ink. So that is where the name of this series comes from, in case anyone is wondering. And I am so honored to have this amazing panel tonight of writers I really love. And we're talking about a topic that is so incredibly timely right now, loneliness. I mean, loneliness is always timely, but particularly in the last year and a half, as Michael said. And so, you know, it's taken on a new meaning during the pandemic for many of us, during kind of the long and bleak months of lockdown. You know, I know friends who lived alone during this time, who went without touching another human being for a long time. And Kristen, I know you wrote in CQ about, and also it was in the New Yorker, about skin hunger, and that became such a topic in the news of people who were going without even touching, without human contact. I recently moved into an apartment by myself and am experiencing the ups and downs of loneliness of living by myself. So this is just something that has been on my mind so much. And when I think about loneliness, I think about one of my favorite books on the topic, Olivia Laing's The Lonely City. And in that book, a book that deals with a time when she felt very lonely while living in New York. And also she looks at loneliness through the lens of a bunch of artists she admires, including Edward Hopper. But one of the things she writes in that book is, what does it feel like to be lonely? It feels like being hungry when everyone around you is readying for a feast. It feels shameful and alarming. And over time, these feelings radiate outwards, making the lonely person increasingly isolated, increasingly estranged. It hurts in the way that feelings do, and it also has physical consequences that take place invisibly inside the closed compartments of the body. It advances, is what I'm trying to say, cold as ice and clear as glass, enclosing and engulfing. So as we get into the winter months, when things really start to feel enclosing and engulfing, and I feel like loneliness is often amplified, especially during the holiday season, I wanted to start out by asking each of you what loneliness means for you as a writer and in your work. Whoever wants to go first. Anyone?
I can go first.
Thanks, you hear me? Mm-hmm.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Michael for organizing this. So it's 5 o'clock here in Montana. Hello, from Montana, my basement. So ever since I was invited to be on this panel, I was trying to figure out if I was lonely or not. And sometimes I think, well, yes, I'm very lonely. And sometimes I think, no, I'm not lonely at all. And sometimes I think, well, I'm intermittently lonely, but it's really not that. It's not intermittent. It's sort of depending on my role or what I'm doing. So I think that in some of my identities, I'm not lonely at all. And in some one, I'm very lonely. In my identity as a person, I just am not lonely. I don't have very many opportunities to be lonely. I have 2 faithful and constant companions with me all the time, 3 if you count the dog. And my pandemic was much far more social than my pre-pandemic life with the children at home from school. But even before I had children, I don't think I suffered from loneliness that much. I remember sometimes traveling where I would feel lonely, and I think I read a lot of books, and I think I went on a lot of walks and found that books are friends and trees are friends and birds are good friends. As a writer, in my identity as a writer, I don't feel lonely either. I find that writing is a very good friend, usually. As a writer, I feel whole and complete, and I don't feel like I'm missing my team. Doesn't feel like a team venture or a team sport. But it feels like, especially in the creation stage, something that is necessarily and happily solitary. And I enjoy that solitary time to write. However, in one of my other identities, in my identity as a musician, I suffer from acute loneliness. And if I am whole or complete as a writer, as a musician, I feel that I am only half a musician, or a third of a musician, or a fourth of a musician, and I'm missing my trio, or I'm missing my band. And if I find out that somebody plays clarinet or drums or cello, I will become aggressively friendly, as only the very lonely can. And I will try to press them into coming and playing with me. And so anyway, I understand both loneliness in some areas and non-loneliness in other areas.
That makes so much sense. And I'm just thinking of the first essay in your book, in the Everybody Ensemble, where you envision like all the animals in the world taking place and having this great big concert. So
oh, that's true. I forgot about that. I'm pressing everybody in the whole world into my ensemble.
I love that. I really love that.
Thank you for saying that.
Of course. What about everyone else on the panel? Love to hear your thoughts on what loneliness means for you as a writer and in your work.
I can go if you want. I like that idea of having different identities, parts of yourself being lonely and other parts not. I think it is interesting to think about loneliness in writing. I tend to write about people alone a lot. And I think what's a lot of times the characters I write about, and certainly it's true in the last book, Wayward, but also I think in the other books as well, I write about women who purposefully seek solitude, who will run away or go underground or hide in some way and really want to be alone. But I think in the sense that the way that Amy was talking about how you have these multiple selves, there's a part of you can want to be alone and want your solitude, and then within that also feel terribly lonely. And that's kind of, I think, when you're in that transition point where you're letting go of one life, maybe like you broke up with somebody, like and you're moving into the new life, you have to sort of let yourself feel lonely in order to kind of go to the new thing, maybe. So it feels sort of built into it. And I think what I've changed in my view of loneliness as I've gotten older is that, when you have a lot of family life going on, you really think, oh, I'll never be alone again, and I wish I could be, and you miss it. But then there's a kind of loneliness where you're lonely for a specific person or for other people that you're not with. Like when my father died, sometimes I feel a very specific longing for him. That's a level of loneliness that will never go away, no matter how populated my life is. And that's something interesting. So I'm starting to get to this idea, and I think this is very true of the character in Wayward, is that her daughter's leaving, and she feels very, very alone. even though she can't really stand to be around anybody. And so there's a perversity in that, about needing to be alone and also feeling the pain of being alone. But sometimes you need to be alone. And then other times I think I used to think when I was young that you would, that I would always want solitude. I'd always want to be alone because I could write and I can read and I could watch movies, I could listen to music. Why would I need other people? But I do think that especially having not seen other people outside my family for so long and not seeing them in person, I love that idea of skin hunger. But you do kind of get the pandemic has really shown me, as it's shown many of us, just how much even the most lonerish type really kind of misses being around people in person and that kind of loneliness. So I feel there are many different levels of loneliness and kinds of loneliness, and they coexist with wanting solitude at the same time.
That's so great. Yeah, Kristen, go ahead.
I mean, I think my relationship to loneliness changed a lot by writing about loneliness for so long. I mean, my book is about loneliness, and I understand loneliness in a different way now, and its complexities and complications. And I also understand like its biological value and why we feel it, which is a really necessary reason because it propels us back towards each other. So I think I also appreciate loneliness in a way, and I try to listen to it more. And I also think it's really important to distinguish the difference between solitude and loneliness, or aloneness and loneliness, which are really disparate things that can sometimes overlap, but not always. And also to understand that everyone has a different, it's like programmed into us before we're born. Everyone has a different threshold for how much loneliness they can tolerate and how much loneliness they are predisposed to feeling. So I think that is something that kind of understanding that these things are inherent within us. And then it helps me not feel like if I experience a period of loneliness, it helps me not feel like it's a personal failing. It's just something my body is programmed to feel. I think that's helpful.
That's great. What about you, Jane?
I love what you're saying here, Kristen, in terms of the difference between loneliness and solitude. I think a lot of my thoughts on loneliness in relationship to just my experiences, but also writing is so tied to kind of, growing up in a way in which I literally was invisible. Kids growing up would just throw rocks at me and yell, "Shut up, Jane," because I didn't speak. I was silent. And so much of my life was so built around this idea that I was invisible, which made me incredibly lonely. And then I started using loneliness as a kind of like shield. Like I was proud to be lonely. Like I'm fine. I hang out with my books at the public library. I grew up in a Chinese American restaurant. My friends were the customers, were people I would never see again. And I think that's a really interesting type of loneliness where I could connect with strangers, these customers, for just a split second. They were my friends, but then I might not see them again. Like I might, and I may not, but I was so lonely for friendship, for community. I did my MFA, at the University of Iowa. And like, I was so lonely at Iowa. Also it's Iowa. Like I was like, where am I? And I was so lonely, and I didn't realize I was lonely until there is a space of community. And I actually went to Kundiman, which is an Asian American literary org, the retreat, I think right after I left Iowa. And everybody was immediately like hugging me, saying, "Welcome, let's be friends." And I actually ran away. I was so scared of like all these people who wanted to be close to me, that I left that evening. I distinctly remember like going to my room, and then there were like little love notes under the door that said like, if you want to come out, like we're here for you. We'll see you the next day. It's totally fine. But I had been so used to being lonely and using it as kind of this like protective shell that I'm actually learning right now how to like not be lonely. And, it's funny. this is the first time me living with a partner, like full time. And I'm just like, ah, like I always want to like, you know, be lonely, or at least be, you know, solitude's different for me. That's kind of thinking about choice in terms of when you choose to be alone. But I was so used to it that now I'm just like, oh, right, there's so much community out there. And I, you know, I still think about myself, you know, obviously as a child, but also as a kind of young adult, you know, going through Iowa, and just and thinking to myself, like, wow, if that was the default for me, you know, what had I been missing out on during those years of care and connection. So I just will never forget that like embarrassing moment of literally running away from a community that was so welcoming. And I love Kuniman. I came the next day and did all the things. But I had no idea I had been that lonely. And that's when like loneliness really gets to you, is when you don't even know it's happening to you. You're just sitting here like, oh, this is the default, right? But so that's my kind of take on it. I think that I love writing now actually with people, which is something I would have never done before, but feels really special to me. I have a thing I call cut and paste, which is a gigantic Google email thread, which by the way ends at 100 emails. So you have to start a new one, where we just share pieces of what we've been working on with no comments, but you know someone there is reading brand new drafts, no comments, no feedback, just these cut and paste, you know, from poets I've, you know, worked with over, you know, many, many years. So that's how I write these days, not lonely at all. So I'll stop there, but I just really love all these thoughts kind of constellating.
I love that too. And I love that collective idea of like writing with sharing those emails. And it reminds me of, I used to run this kind of accountability group for writers called Get Your Ass on the Bench and Write, where in Brooklyn, where we would meet up, and the rule was you're not supposed to socialize. It's a time to just be together at the table and writing. And I really miss doing that. And that's the kind of stuff that like I really missed from pre-pandemic, because it is important to have that kind of connection. And a lot of you mentioned the difference between solitude, right, and loneliness. It's so true. And actually the very first Red Ink panel I ever hosted was all about finding solitude in a noisy world, and how critical that is as an artist. But with loneliness, right, you know, I think, you know, some of you mentioned like not really having always opportunities to be lonely because of having kids or being around other people. But I think that you can, I don't know about anyone here, but I sometimes feel like I'm never lonelier than when I'm around other people. Sometimes that amplifies my loneliness in a way. And so I think loneliness can be really deceptive. We can surround ourselves with other people, but feel incredibly lonely at the same time. And I'm wondering, some of you already spoke about this a little bit, but how did your relationship to loneliness change or transform or stay the same during this pandemic so far? Anyone care to chime in?
I mean, I think that's like the question around loneliness right now. I think what was interesting for me about it is I was finishing up edits on a book about loneliness, and then suddenly everyone was talking about loneliness. And like prior to that, it felt like loneliness was something that people didn't really talk about very often. It felt kind of shameful. It felt like it hadn't really been destigmatized. But I do think that the loneliness of the pandemic was a very specific kind of loneliness that's very different from like the epidemic problems of loneliness in America and in a lot of countries, which are really deeply rooted. And I mean, there was an imposed isolation with the pandemic, and there was also something kind of communal about it. There was the sense that we were all in like going through the same thing. And I think one of the things that's so difficult about loneliness in regular times is that you feel at odds with everyone else. Like that quote you read, Michele, from Olivia Lang, about this idea that like everyone else is sitting down to a feast when you're hungry. And there was this sort of stabilizing feeling during the pandemic that everyone was isolated in the same way. And I also think that we showed up for each other during the pandemic in a way we haven't in a long time. Like mutual aid organizations formed, like we checked in on our neighbors, like I felt that pretty acutely. And those are the kinds of things I think we need to do all the time to abate kind of community-wide loneliness.
Totally. I agree with you. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
I can chime in a tiny bit. I was just thinking, one of my students shared with me a poem that basically says, now that things are slightly, opening up in the sense of like, vaccination, et cetera, that they have never been so lonely, in like missing that online community, missing a lot of that connection that's been made over this particular time period, because now it's kind of awkward. There's something that's like a little like this, being back in person, at least in the classroom, and just kind of walking around. It feels like there's something that's not quite touching, but it's kind of close, kind of like an asymptote, I guess. But for me, I think during the pandemic, the one thing, and I love that quote you shared with the kind of hunger, is that, I grew up in a restaurant, and I didn't learn to cook my entire life because my family was just pushing me out of the restaurant and it's like, go to school. And I learned to cook for the very first time, like, in my like mid 30s, to kind of really think about like what it means to kind of feel like, to eat, to make meals, to feel as if I'm connected to people. And I had a lot of, they were silly, but I had a lot of like Zoom dinners where we made the same exact thing at the same time. And so it felt a little closer, but I had never really cooked before, like really. And so it felt really special to me to kind of like it felt less lonely to cook. Like that was how I managed it, was to feed myself and to feed and drop off food for other people. People were dropping off food for me. It just felt like that was the one thing that kept me not as lonely, was like the eating and feeding and cooking, specifically meals that, come from my childhood and give me comfort. But so I'll add that too. But yeah, I love your point too about kind of what it means to show up for each other, I think, during this time too, Kristen.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you, Dana and Amy, do you have anything to add to that?
I do think the pandemic also, well, some of the community that people were building, sometimes you'd hear about people having these, pandemic bubbles and like really thriving in the pandemic. and then in a weird kind of way, it felt partially because of what Kristen was saying, that we were all in the same sort of boat, but also we weren't, though, right? Like some people had really different experiences than other people did, and some people didn't get those connections, and some people didn't have the bubbles, and some people couldn't do the bubble. And so even within this kind of common experience, it felt like there was ways to do it wrong, or or to be. So in some ways it felt, I don't know if that's comes under the category of lonely, or just sort of alienated, maybe in some ways. Maybe that's another way of thinking about it. But I did, one thing I really did find that I agreed with a lot of people as a coping mechanism for the loneliness of the pandemic was the pets, being the importance of the pets and dogs and cats, and having the animals in your life. And I thought, that I realized that as the older people that I know, especially the ones who were by themselves, the ones who had pets, really did much better and felt less loneliness in some ways. And so I think maybe that's just that connection with animals seemed really important, more important than ever. Yeah.
Amy?
I just saw a woman walking her pig, and she it was such a beautiful pig. And I told her I had just dreamed of adopting a pig. I did not adopt a pig during the pandemic, but I did adopt a dog. We were driven to get a dog after 3 years of recovering from our very, very special dog that we we had a lot. I will say that for the the pandemic here also got me teaching. The university here in Bozeman, I guess they had expected fewer freshmen than usual last year, and they had more freshmen than usual, so I became an emergency teacher. And I was teaching, you know, for a lot of the students I was teaching, the only class that was in person. I mean, we were all masked, but I know they expressed pretty often how much they appreciated being in person and being able to talk in person. There's nothing like it.
Absolutely. I just started teaching in person again this fall, and I didn't realize how much I missed it until I was back in the classroom. Dana, when I interviewed you about Wayward for the Los Angeles Times, we talked during that conversation about anger in your book with the main character, both in the context with the main character, but also in the age that we live in. You know, you address like Trump being in power, and I'm wondering how anger connects with loneliness in your novel. If you could talk about the connection between the two.
I mean, I think that if you when the character Sam is looking back on these anger incidents that she had, I think the way that not liking yourself in a certain way, or the way that you're behaving, and that feeling that you get where maybe this is a little bit like what Jane was saying about how you're so invested, you're kind of pushing people away. You know, and in a weird kind of way, anger is a way of getting attention, but bad attention maybe. There's righteous anger, but there's also just this kind of fruitless anger, where you're sort of just you're not resilient in the way that you expect yourself to be, so that feels sort of you're exposing more than you want of your emotions. You feel out of control, and that's and that pushes people away or puts people off, and it's kind of I think for Sam sort of humiliating a bit, and that at the same time, and you know, all these things can be undercut by the other side of it. I think that she feels that a lot of the anger that she has, she's just been suppressing, and it's been there all along. And so there's something empowering about letting herself express what she's feeling. So so those are, yeah, I mean, I think she's going through a kind of crucible of many contradictory feelings about loneliness, about anger, about all of her relationship to the world, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Kristen, in CQ, one of my favorite lines is when you write, "Perhaps we see loneliness in others simply to feel less lonely ourselves." And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that idea.
I think it relates to what I was saying earlier about how one of the difficulties of loneliness is that it feels shameful. It feels like something you're experiencing that no one else is, which is never true. And so I think we look for, I forget what I always forget the phrase for what it's called when you are thinking a lot about something and then you start seeing it everywhere, confirmation bias. And I think it's like that when you're in a certain state of mind, you're like looking for clues for like the universe to reflect that back to you. And so I think if you see a solitary person, you can kind of project a sort of world or a life onto them that kind of reinforces what you need to see in that moment. I definitely felt like that during periods of loneliness, especially in New York, when you get to observe a lot of strangers, sometimes for prolonged periods of time, like on the subway.
Kristen, can I ask Kristen a question?
Yeah. Please.
I'm fascinated about this idea, and I'm going to use the wrong words for it, but that there's a kind of like a loneliness set point that sort of everyone has that's different.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? That's so interesting to me.
Yes, you mean like the biological thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, everyone just has a certain threshold that's programmed into them for how frequently they're going to feel lonely, or like what that threshold is. It's sort of related to how much time they can tolerate alone, but it's not.
It's something you're born with. It's not something you get from your childhood or anything.
No, it's totally biological. I mean, like, loneliness is a biological, it's like it's something. Okay, so in the grand scheme of human evolution, we felt loneliness because being alone is really dangerous. So our brains can't differentiate the feeling of physical pain from emotional pain, and loneliness is emotional pain. So our brains are responding the same way we are when we're in physical danger, which when we were in like early humans, if you were alone, it was really, really dangerous because there were like bears and woolly mammoths or whatever. And if you were alone, you were going to like freeze to death or starve. So it was like loneliness is like it's trying to propel you back towards other people. So I think like it's helpful for me to think about loneliness as just like this part of our biology, and then how, you know, we live so differently now than the way that humans used to. So when we're in these prolonged states, you know, where we're working remotely or where we're working in cubicles or whatever, and we're not interacting with one another in the same way, and we're in that heightened state of loneliness for a really long time, it's doing really, really dangerous things to our bodies. And so I think it's helpful to sometimes for me to separate it from even an emotional feeling and think about it as something more physiological.
This is so fascinating. And I'm wondering, actually, one more question for you, Kristen, which is, I'm wondering if you can talk about illustrating loneliness versus writing about it, like what that experience was like in working on your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the biggest challenge was like, how do I stop just like drawing a person alone in an empty room? You know, like there are these sort of like cliched images of loneliness that you fall to. Although I did also want to represent the cliches of loneliness because I think they speak to how we understand and contextualize loneliness. But for me, like the rule was if I could say it in a drawing, I wouldn't write it.
That's great. Thank you. Jane, I'm wondering if you could read a poem for us from your new book, How to Not Be Afraid of Everything. I'm wondering if you could read Lessons on Lessening before I ask you the question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. I'm still processing what just happened in the conversation. So I'm like, okay, take a moment, which is very cool. Lessons on Lessening. I wake to the sound of my neighbors upstairs as if they are bowling. And maybe they are, all pins and love fallen over. I lay against the floor, if only to feel that kind of affection. What I've learned time and again, get up. You cannot have what they have. And the eyes of a dead rat can't say anything. In Jersey, the sink breaks and my mother keeps a bucket underneath to save water for laundry. A trickle of water is no joke, I've learned that. Neither is my father wielding a knife in starlight. I was taught that everything and everyone is self-made, that you can make a window out of anything if you want. This is why I froze insects, to see if they will come back to life. How I began to see each day the swoosh of wings get up, the ants pouring out of the sink onto my arms and dish heavy water. My arms, branches, a swarm I didn't ask for. No one told me I'd have to learn to be polite, to let myself be consumed for what I cannot control. I must return to my younger self, to wearing my life like heavy wool weaved in my own weight, to pretend not to know when the debtors come to collect.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading that.
Thanks, Michelle.
I'm so moved by the way that poem, the entire poem, but by the way the poem opens with this idea of the speaker hearing the noise from an upstairs apartment and being separated by the love and affection that they imagine above, in the apartment above. And I'm wondering, is loneliness a kind of lessening? Can you, bringing in the title of that poem?
Yeah, I love that question. And I mean, it's funny, all the seeds of my poems all do start from real things. Like I was so lonely writing this poem. I distinctly remember hearing my neighbors above me hanging out, like roll. It sounded like bowling, and I just sat on the floor listening to them, and it did feel as if like if I just sat there long enough, maybe I could be part of what they were doing. Like I don't know, but I think that it's kind of almost the opposite. I almost felt like loneliness was accumulating, and if anything, to be weaved in my own weight by the end of the poem. Like I wanted to learn from my younger self, as I was sharing with you all, just kind of like what the power of loneliness can do too is not something that we think of as lessening us, but actually giving us strength to some degree. And maybe that is just a warped way of trying to redefine what loneliness is when you're lonely. But I think that moment of just laying against the floor and just trying to be a part of something that I knew I couldn't be a part of, felt like an accumulation, as if maybe there was someone underneath me, in the apartment building that was doing the same exact thing, potentially, kind of what, Kristen was talking about, like looking for the other lonely person of sorts. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this book, though, it's funny because it's, in many ways it's about, my family and hunger and if there's a lot of food in here, but, it's called How to Not Be Afraid of Everything. And even though this is constantly a book that's being like, I guess, marketed as like, oh, like about the Great Leap Forward, about hunger, about gluttony, it's also like heartbreak poems, and like a lot of them. And, in many ways, I was so fearful of that loneliness as a result of lack of like intimate relation, and constantly being left, which is an experience I've had a lot of, just like absolute disappearance out of nowhere, completely not knowing it was like that, was gone. And so actually one person actually literally disappeared into like Alaska. And I keep thinking about this, like how lonely I felt in that kind of these moments of heartache in particular. So thank you for that question. I don't know how we ended up in the Heartbreak Hotel, but I think that is a part of loneliness for me that I have to admit to, of my band of ex-boyfriends that are still playing at some shitty dive bar somewhere. But I'll just leave it there. But thank you for your question.
I really, really love that. Thank you.
Please write a poem with that title also.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with Kristen.
Gosh.
Yes.
Yeah, in case anybody wants to bring their exes along too, I'm sure there's a parade somewhere.
Amy, in your new book of essays, there's a really great quote at the end of the Modern Moose essay. You write, yes to the pond where the water plants thrive. Yes to the pond where the water plants fail. Yes to the pock where the pond used to be. Yes to you healthy. Yes to you sick. Yes to you blooming. And yes to you stricken. Though you have seen better days, though you no longer delight me with coltsfoot and lilies, yes to the earth, my earth, for I do not hope to find a better where. Can you talk about this exuberant defiance that's threaded throughout your book and how that relates to loneliness?
Oh, I like exuberant defiance. So that came from an essay about the modern moose, because I was thinking, well, I mean, we think of ourselves as so modern, but moose are also modern. So they should be respected too, as equally as Elon Musk and company. And so how are they dealing with things these days? And so I think that comes in where I was saying that the moose have maybe vows to the earth, like marriage vows, like the lunatic vows that lovers make to each other, that even if they find a better who, they're still going to stay faithful to that first self. And that is like the moose, not the mouse. Although mice also are faithful to the earth. Whereas some people are looking to rocket away to other places, the moose is faithful to the earth, even if she's seen better days.
Yeah, that's a wonderful essay. The whole book is wonderful. Thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you.
And I want to leave some time for audience Q&A. I have some more questions, but I want to get to the audience first. So now is the time to submit questions if you have any. We do have a couple already to go. The first one comes from Kyle. In the age of social media, what would your advice be for someone who is chronically lonely? No family, no circle of friends, no partner, etc. Does anyone have any advice for Kyle?
I'll say, remember that social media isn't real, and what people post on social media is not representative of reality. But also, I always get asked about like, how is technology making us lonelier? And like, in a lot of ways it is, but it's also a tool that can be used well or misused. And I think the problem with technology and social media is that we misuse it so often. But, you know, I also have a lot of people in my life who found really essential communities through the internet. People who are like geographically separated from each other, or from communities, or people who have mobility issues and are housebound, things like that. So I think it is important to recognize that there is still space on the internet to connect, while still recognizing that what people post on Instagram is not representative of reality.
That is
yeah.
so true.
And I wanted to add to that as well. I was just thinking that since we are, this is a Books Are Magic, this is a books event, I would just say that that part of the reason I think that social media can be so make you feel lonely is because, as Kristen was saying, it's so artificial and it is superficial in that representation of people's lives, so that it feels as though there's a party going on that all the time, and you're not in it. But I would say that reading books, and then using the internet as a way of connecting with other people who read books, book clubs. I moved around when I was a kid. We moved about 12 times, so I was often without friends or the new kid, and books really helped me feel less alone. And that's like a cliche, because it's really true that you do get that sense of connecting with somebody on a deeper level. So maybe finding a deeper way to connect would be through books, reading books, and then talking about books with other people who have also read those same books. That seems like a really wonderful use of the internet. And I mean, people do it in person, of course, but it seems that a lot of people are doing it virtually. And I think it's also not talking about yourself, it's talking about characters, or it's talking about the subject of the book. And so this connection isn't so much about presentation of self in some kind of performance, but rather about it engaging in, thinking about characters or thinking about people in a different way. I think that's a better connection to make than through social media in a lot of ways. Yeah.
That's great. Jane, did
Michele,
you
that's how we became friends, is talking about books on the internet, when I was very lonely in Kentucky and had no friends in Kentucky.
That's so true.
Yeah.
Yes. So yay for social media can be a wonderful way to connect. And books, both brought together. Yeah, Jane, were you going to say something? I didn't.
Oh, I wasn't, but I'm just looking at all the great questions that are ahead, and that there's one that is from Sarah that I'm very intrigued by the non-human world offering us companionship or relief from our aloneness. And I know we've already talked about kind of animal relationships, and kind of, I so badly want to adopt a dog, and I've been on this journey. Actually, this is great. So many animals have been adopted that it's, especially adopting a rescue, that it's actually kind of hard to find an animal actually these days. But I was actually thinking about my answer to that question is so tied to this new book of mine, because I was thinking about the non-human world. So in terms of like my ghosts and my ancestors, I never really feel that alone if I keep thinking about the fact that I do have this very deep connection, spiritual connection, I think, to the dead, and to like my grandparents, my great grandparents. Like I do talk to them in these poems, and I feel, and I have altar spaces. I feel like it's some that to me always feels like a means of comfort, because I know ultimately like my ghosts have survived so much that like I feel very comforted by them. Maybe that's not the non-human world you're thinking of, but for me, I really tend to my ghosts. And there's this kind of ritual of cleaning the graves, usually in the springtime, where families will come together, Chinese families will come together and go to the gravesite and have this party and have a feast and clear the graves, and to tell our ghosts that we have not forgotten them. Like, I don't want them to be lonely. This is something that's really important to me, is to know that my ghosts are not lonely, that we're still in connection. So I just really like thinking about like these other connections that are more spiritual, I think, for me, which still doesn't, it's still funny. Like, I asked my mom growing up, like, do I have a religion? My mom was like, no, like, you're just Chinese. And I was like, what does that even mean? but some of these things, right, that just I just is part of my life. So if I am a companion for my ghosts, the ghosts are companions for me. And it just, yeah, not to get woo-woo, but that is like, that I do believe that. I really do. Like, I always talk to my ghosts. So
I love that. I love that. And Jane is answering the question from Sarah about thoughts on the non-human world offering us companionship, relief from our aloneness, any resonance with species going extinct. And I think that's also a great question for Amy to answer, if you have any response to that, Amy.
Sure. Some of the species that I wrote about in the book were not going extinct. I just felt so much resonance with them. So I had gone to nonfiction school a long time ago and tried to write about myself. And even though it was nonfiction and I was writing the facts, I didn't actually recognize myself when I wrote about myself. But when I started writing about goats, you were talking about ghosts, Jane. Well, I like to think about goats. my friends and the pandas, and the friend I made, I suppose, in this last book was the mesquite tree, who I really resonated with, because it sends its roots up to like 150 feet down into the ground looking for water, and it is so thirsty that it sends its roots that far down, like the thirst. And maybe there's some resonance with loneliness there, but it sort of pulls its roots all the way down. And for a while I was having a hard time writing, and I found that not writing it was actually harder than writing. And I felt this resonance with the mesquite tree, looking for water and not being able to find it, but still going farther down. I will say, when I have tried to write about species going extinct, I tend to go satirical. I feel like I can deal with my sort of tragic feelings better when I don't deal indirectly with the loss of some of these animals that we will be lonely for forever if they go away.
Absolutely. We have a few more audience questions that I'm hoping we can get to quickly. So I'm wondering if anyone has a response to Krista's question of what happens when you know that being alone can be dangerous and that loneliness is meant to propel you toward others for support and safety. And yet when you try to reach out for that support, you don't receive it. Have any of you experienced that? And if so, how did you handle it? I see people nodding. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I think everyone has experienced that and probably experiences that all the time. I think I don't usually handle it very well. I won't speak to how I handle it, but I'll say how we should handle it, which is to keep trying, because like kind of like one person being shut off doesn't mean that everyone is. And one of the dangerous parts about loneliness is that, similar to kind of like what Jane was talking about at the beginning of our conversation about how it causes us to turn inward. And I think the more that we isolate in that way, the harder it becomes to make connections. So I think just like we have to try to overcome that discomfort. It's called hypervigilance. Olivia Lang also writes about that in her book. And there's Sherry Turkle writes about it a lot. There's a lot of there's a book called Loneliness by John Cacioppo that addresses this. But I think that's the state we really need to work to overcome. So kind of pushing past that.
Great. And I think we have time for just one more question here from Robin. Robin says, first of all, I just wanted to say I'm really honored to listen to all of you speak about your experiences so eloquently and beautifully. I remember Jane mentioned that she used loneliness as a shield. I was wondering how you or other authors would describe your experience of vulnerability around feeling lonely and how you get up the courage to be vulnerable. Thank you so much.
Ooh, I love all these words that we're like relating to loneliness, thinking about alienation, thinking about solitude, thinking about vulnerability now. And I think it is very vulnerable to say you're lonely and to speak of your experiences in that light, because, as we're talking about social media, it's all the opposite, to like appear as if you're doing so many things, that you're, have a lot of friends, you're eating out, you're doing all these things. And I think, thinking about vulnerability and, to kind of get to that place of being vulnerable, I'm still working through it. I think I don't really know exactly, using loneliness as a shield for me is kind of really learning for me, like what it means to be in community, and to be in community means to be to some degree vulnerable and to share your experiences with the hope, right? Fingers crossed that they also will share back to you. And that's kind of thinking about the last question, like when there is, and somebody is still, reticent about sharing, like having understanding for that, I think. But I feel like as I've gotten older, I've just been more and more kind of vulnerable in the sense of admitting, especially embarrassment. I think that also a related word, maybe, but just kind of, I'm okay with, like, I wouldn't have been okay eating alone at a restaurant in my 20s. I just wouldn't have done it. And that's kind of, I was so scared, even though, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself. Whereas now I'm just like, I don't care. Like, there's something about my vulnerability that's also like a shield maybe of like, I don't careness. So I'm still working my shields. I think I still have them. That said, I was just thinking of Amy mentioning like satire and just like humor, maybe joking about it, loosen some of that vulnerability away from me. But yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to add, but yeah, vulnerability.
Yeah, does anyone have anything to add to that?
Maybe one little thing, kind of like was it Jane who you had talked about the power of loneliness? Somebody had talked about the power of loneliness. I don't know. I'm thinking about the power of vulnerability, that it can make you more sympathetic to other people. And I just think about my father, who all day visits shut-ins who can't leave the house, and it means so much to them. And maybe we can, use this experience of loneliness and vulnerability to befriend other people. And maybe that's the the blessing of it.